We're back. Had to take a quick break there. Next, we're going to cover the 4 different types of animal tissues. And in general, with each different type of tissue, you should be able to list a general function and then what the specific examples are of those tissue types and what those functions are as well. And where they are located, where in the human body. So we're going to start with epithelial tissue. And there are many different types of epithelial tissue. Before we get into the structure of each individual one, let's go over the general function of epithelial tissue. In general, epithelial tissue lines stuff. Lines the body, lines all of our organs, and its function as a lining can either be as a barrier, like the skin, or as an interface for gas exchange or nutrients. So if gas exchange is the function, then the interface will serve for diffusion. If it's nutrients being exchanged, either absorbed into the bloodstream or perhaps enzymes are being secreted into the intestinal lumen, then nutrient exchange or chemical exchange could be by either secretion or absorption. All right. So we have several different types. We have cuboidal tissue. Cuboidal epithelium has cube-shaped cells. I'm going to draw 2-dimensional versions of our cell shapes here. And I briefly want to go over the different cell shapes and some simple versus stratified. So when a tissue type is called cuboidal, that means that the cells themselves are plump cube-shaped cells. Columnar tissue has column-shaped cells. Squamous tissue, not to be confused with cuboidal, have thin flat squares. So the 2-dimensional drawing of squamous tissue wouldn't be a square, but a thin flat rectangle. The squares would be on the tops of the tissue. So here we have columnar again, which means that our column-shaped cells, and here we have squamous again, which means we have thin flat squares. Next, we have either simple tissue or stratified. Simple tissue means a single layer, whereas stratified tissues have multiple layers. And then pseudo-stratified means we sort of have layers, but we could say overlapping cells. So if you look closely at the picture, there is one cell attached to the basement membrane and one nucleus as you go up, but some of the cells will overlap some of the other cells, creating the artificial appearance of layers. And so if you have one cell at a time, but they overlap one another, then we'll call that pseudo-stratified columnar. Okay, so that refers to the structure of all of the different epithelial tissue types. Now let's consider the functions. Cuboidal tissue, they are found in a single layer, but that single layer is often wrapped in a tubule. And the major function of cuboidal tissue would be secretion. And we find cuboidal tissue in our kidney tubules, and kidney tubules secrete a lot of substances like bicarbonate to moderate pH of the fluids that are going to be re-entering the bloodstream. We'll also find cuboidal tissue in other ducts and glands, like the salivary glands, the tear ducts, etc. So in the salivary glands, we secrete salivary amylase. In our tear glands, we secrete tears. All right, the major area are the kidney tubules. And this shows you what those tubules can look like made of the cuboidal epithelium tissue. All right, our simple columnar tissue is going to be located in the GI tract. So all along the gastrointestinal tract, not just the small intestine, but the stomach as well. And the major function is going to be secretion of gastric juices and absorption of nutrients after our food has been digested. All right, and we will see these when we get to the digestive system lecture. A lot of the tissues have macrofolds called villi, and then even within a villus, the individual cells will have little folds at the top as well, called microvilli. So there's a lot of surface area for maximizing secretion and absorption. Our simple squamous tissue is going to have the greatest surface area to volume ratio of all of our tissue types, as shown by these thin flat squares and the fact that it's just a single layer. The simple squamous tissue, therefore, is the best at diffusion. The blood vessels that go to the simple squamous tissue have a high permeability to gases. And remember that gases are small nonpolar gases that can easily diffuse across phospholipid bilayers. So our simple squamous tissue is the perfect tissue to line the capillaries of the lung. So because of the structure, I'm going to make this more specific, the capillaries that enter the alveoli of the lungs. And the alveoli are the air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Because of the thin flat shape, we've got maximum diffusion of oxygen and CO2. Right. Next, we have our pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The pseudostratified columnar tissue is going to be found in the trachea and the bronchi. And what is notable about these cells is that at the surface of the cells, let's say this is the columnar cell, they have hairs protruding or protrusions from the cell surface called cilia. And this cilia moves mucus up and out of the lungs. It's called the ciliatory mucus escalator. So it moves mucus in an upward fashion to keep it out of the lungs. Okay. And now we have our major type of epithelial tissue that lines the skin and all of the orifices of the body, like the mouth, nose, ears, vagina, urethra, etc. The stratified squamous epithelium. So we've got multiple layers. The new cells are formed towards the basement membrane, which is the layer underneath the epithelial tissue, exposed to the inside of the body. This is the free surface, which means it's exposed to the outside. So newer cells are generated closer to the basement membrane. This is where you'll have melanocytes, the melanin-producing types of cells. And the older dead cells are pushed outwards until you get to the outermost layer, which contains a lot of the dead cells containing a lot of keratin. And so keratin is that insoluble protein that makes skin a really good insoluble barrier against things entering the body. So another thing about stratified squamous epithelial is that because growth of cells continues, you're often going to find these wherever our skin or our orifice tissues slough off. So sloughing is the removal of these outer layers on a continual basis. So in the urethra, every time we urinate, the outer layers of our stratified squamous epithelial tissue in the urethra will shed and come out with the urine. And so that's a good way to prevent urinary tract infections. If you slough off the outermost layers of the cells, then the pathogens will slough off with them. All right. Next, we have connective tissue. And connective tissue, if we want to keep it very simple, connects stuff. The connective tissue has cells, and the type of tissue is going to mean that the cells have a definitive extracellular matrix. So the tissues are defined by what the cell's extracellular matrix is, or ECM. We learned about that in Unit 1. So I'd review those slides for your final. The extracellular matrix is usually a lot of extracellular glycoprotein fibers that are anchored to the cell membrane by integrin proteins. And a lot of times that extracellular matrix consists of collagen fibers. So collagen, or loose connective tissue, sometimes I just refer to that as collagen. Loose connective tissue consists of cells that have collagen extracellular matrix fibers. And these usually bind epithelial tissues to underlying tissues or hold organs in place. So this will be very common in the skin. It just kind of holds stuff together, especially in the dermis layer. You'll see a lot of loose connective tissue. Holds things together. In our fibrous connective tissues, we have tendons and ligaments. These also have an extracellular matrix that consists of collagen fibers, but they're more dense, and the tendons connect muscle to bone, whereas the ligaments connect bone to bone at the joints. Okay. Our bone tissue has an extracellular matrix of a calcified mineral rather than a fiber. So bone has a solidified or mineralized extracellular matrix. Made of the calcium phosphate mineral. The cells are called osteocytes, and the bone-forming unit is called an osteon. You'll see more on this in the lab slides for next week. So, of course, bone tissue is the primary tissue of our skeletal system. Adipose tissue has many functions. It insulates, and it protects vital organs, and it also stores energy. So adipocytes are the cells that store fat droplets. So remember, the structure of a fat is our 3-carbon glycerol. And each carbon atom of the glycerol is covalently linked by an ester linkage to 3 fatty acid hydrocarbon tails. All right, so this fat can serve to insulate, protect, or as an energy storage site. And we'll find adipose tissue underneath the skin and the subcutaneous layer, and also surrounding a lot of our visceral organs. Cartilage is going to be found in our joints to cushion bones at the joints. So cartilage has cells called chondrocytes, and the extracellular matrix also consists of collagen, but a rubbery, more flexible type of fiber. One of the compounds that builds that fiber is glucosamine, a nitrogen-containing monomer. So the polymer is called chondroitin sulfate. So if you take glucosamine or chondroitin supplements, That is to help build your cartilage. You don't have to remember that. So I don't even know if I'm spelling it right. So that's what's made of glucosamine. I give my aging dog glucosamine because of her stiff bones. And of course, collagen. So it's a very rubbery and protective extracellular matrix, and it cushions the bones at the joints. Last, we have our blood cells. So our blood cells include red and white blood cells as well as platelets, and the extracellular matrix is a liquid. The liquid component of blood is plasma. So our bloodstream is the only type of tissue that has a liquid extracellular matrix. And we're going to go into the functions of all the different types of blood cells in the circulatory system lecture. So for right now, it doesn't really connect a body part to one another, but it connects nutrients and gases throughout the body. So it's involved in the transportation of nutrients and gases. All right, now we have our muscle tissue. The simple definition of the function of muscle tissue is contraction. So all muscle tissues contract via a contractile unit called a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is the contractile unit of a muscle. And I'm going to show you a very short video on how that works before we get into the differences of skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscles.
I'm going to go into the details of muscle contraction. This is going to be the last video in the muscle contraction series, so enjoy. Let's get right into it. Now, you can always go back to episode 42 to refresh your memory, but we said that the functional unit of contraction is called the sarcomere, and that is what we're looking at right now. This unit is one sarcomere. And we said that we had a thick filament that was called myosin, and we have a thin filament that is called actin. And we said that when muscle contraction happens, the motor neuron releases neurotransmitter that stimulates calcium release. And when that happens, the fibers slide against each other, just like this. So as the muscle fibers become shorter, that is the muscle contracting. And you can clearly see that in this animation. Now, the reason we said that this can happen is because on the myosin filaments, we have these heads, and those heads extend and bind to the actin. And when they bind, they kind of flex. So it moves in this direction, and that pulls the actin, shortening the sarcomere. So what we're going to do today.
All right, so that is the basics of how a muscle fiber contracts. Now we're going to go over the difference between skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. And we're going to define some new words. So skeletal muscle is striated. What striated means is that there are multiple sarcomeres in one muscle fiber. So multiple sarcomeres per fiber. And it creates this stripy appearance. So striated for stripy. So they are striated, and they are involved in voluntary muscle contraction. So these are the muscles surrounding the skeletal systems and control whether or not we are moving our arms and legs, running, sitting, standing, chewing, etc. So they're involved in voluntary muscle contractions. They are contractions that we can control. I'm going to move to the cardiac muscle. We'll compare that to skeletal muscle. Similar to skeletal muscle, the muscle fibers are striated and have multiple sarcomeres per unit, and you can see some of those stripes. They are striated, but as they are found in the heart, and we don't control whether or not our heart beats, they are involved in involuntary muscle contractions. So the only location for cardiac muscle is our heart, and the only time that muscle rests is in between our heartbeats and after our heart stops beating. Smooth muscle is found all along the gastrointestinal tract. It is important for movement of food along the GI tract in a downward direction, down the esophagus into the stomach, from the stomach into the small intestine, all throughout the small intestine into the large intestine, etc. So the GI tract muscle tissue, or this smooth muscle tissue, it's smooth, so it's not stripy and ragged in appearance. It is not striated, unstriated, and it's involved in involuntary muscle contractions. We do not control the movement of food along our GI tract. All right. Finally, we have our nervous tissue, and nervous tissue, the function is to sense and transmit signals. Those signals are called neurotransmitter signals. The communication molecules secreted and received by the nervous system. So it's one of two body systems involved in coordinating body systems and their activities. There are two types of cells rather than two types of tissues. So there are only one type of tissue, but two cell types within the nervous system. The first is the neuron. This is the major type. It's less in number, but this drives the function. So we have a cell body, which has the nucleus. We have the dendrites. This looks like a creepy giant eyeball. The dendrites receive neurotransmitters. And then we have the long axon, which sends the signals. So the signal goes in this direction, and then the synaptic space would be the space in between neurons, or the neuromuscular junction would be the space in between a neuron and a muscle cell. So the axons transmit the signal. So as far as the function of the nervous tissue is concerned, neurons are the main type, but glial cells actually are higher in number, and these are the cells that nourish and support and insulate the neuron cells. Pictured here is something that we've seen in our lecture notes before. When we first learned about platyhelminthes, I had in one of the pictures I said that they have eye spots or ganglia. And here's a picture of a ganglion, which is the singular of a ganglia. And a ganglion is just a bundle of cell bodies and dendrites in the center, and then all of these are the axons extending. So it's sort of the precursor to the nerves, where the nerves are coming out of the cell bodies. So the ganglion would just be considered a mass of nerve cells. All right, that's it for tissues. Next up is to review the general differences between all the body system types. This picture shows the typical body of an animal of a coelomate that has a circulatory system and and a respiratory system. So here we have our complete digestive tract. In the digestive system, the major function is to digest food into nutrients that can be absorbed into the bloodstream. That our cells can use. So in the digestive system, in the space within the alimentary canal, digestion occurs, and then the nutrients are absorbed into our bloodstream. So then we have the circulatory system, which transports those nutrients throughout the body. The circulatory system also has to transport gases, and so that is what the respiratory system is for. And the respiratory system, we get the influx of oxygen, and that can diffuse into the circulatory system. And then we also have the release of carbon dioxide, which is a metabolic waste product. Other metabolic waste products that aren't gases, like urea, for example, has to be excreted out another way. So our digestive wastes come out our digestive tract through the anus. Our metabolic waste, like urea, is formed in our kidneys to make urine, and that comes out via a separate system called an excretory system. So our metabolic wastes are disposed by a different system than our digestive wastes. We are going to cover a lot of the organs and tissues of the digestive, circulatory, and respiratory system. And since we're going to be discussing blood, we're also going to touch briefly on the immune system as well in the second lecture. You should know the functions of the excretory system and the major organs that go with that excretory system. So the kidneys, the bladder, and the urethra are involved in removal of those metabolic wastes. Endocrine system is involved in hormone production. Reproductive system is involved in gametogenesis to produce gametes that will be involved in sexual reproduction. Our nervous system transmits neurosignals or neurotransmitters. The integumentary system includes the skin and its derivatives. And then, of course, our skeletal and muscle tissue or systems include our bones and muscles, which are important in the support of the body and movement of our body. So you should know the general functions of each of our body systems. And here's a practice question for you all. For your exam, and I'm going to follow up this question with a review question. So which two body systems together are involved in coordination and control of other body systems in their activities? Integumentary and skeletal, digestive and reproductive, endocrine and nervous, endocrine and reproductive, or immune and lymphatic? Correct. It's the endocrine and nervous systems. The endocrine system will produce hormones, while the nervous system will produce neurotransmitters. So let's follow this up with a review question. We've learned about hormones before. Review question. A hormone can belong to which classes of macromolecules? Lipids and nucleic acids, carbohydrates and lipids, proteins and lipids, or proteins and carbohydrates? Correct. Proteins and lipids. Remember that steroids are a type of lipid that some can function as hormones. So we have steroid hormones, which include testosterone and estradiol. And then we have peptide hormones, which will include things like insulin and our thyroid hormones. So peptide is smaller than a protein, but it is made of amino acid monomers joined together by peptide bonds. Okay. I do have in your study guide that you should know a little bit about hormones. So we're not going to cover the endocrine system as a whole, but let's go over just some of those examples of hormones. So thyroid hormones are secreted by the thyroid gland, and these are peptide hormones that are involved in regulation of cellular metabolism. And so if you are hypothyroid, you produce less of these thyroid hormones, and you are more likely to have a slow metabolism or prone to gaining weight. If you have hyperthyroid disorder, then you produce a massive amount of these hormones and will have a very fast metabolism, which sounds like it shouldn't be a problem, but it can be associated with heart disease. Insulin is a very important hormone in the body. It's a peptide hormone and it's made in the pancreas. And it regulates blood glucose levels. So insulin will be secreted into the bloodstream by the pancreas when our glucose levels are high. And that insulin will trigger cells to take up the glucose and convert that glucose through an anabolic pathway into glycogen, which is a glucose storage form in animal muscle cells. When glucose levels are low in the bloodstream, if you have low blood sugar, this will inhibit the release of insulin, and another hormone called glucagon will be released. And this glucagon will trigger cellular catabolism of glycogen, which will break that glycogen down into glucose, and then the glucose is released into the bloodstream. So insulin is one of the major hormones that regulates blood glucose levels. And finally, progesterone. This is an example of a steroid hormone. And remember, steroids are lipids. This is produced after ovulation, so during the latter portion of the menstrual cycle. And this is an important hormone that prepares the uterus for implantation. So I want to cover very briefly this process, since we're going to be skipping the reproductive system lecture this year. And I want to relate it to what we learned in Unit 4. So in Unit 4, we learned that egg fertilization results in the formation of a zygote, and then that zygote develops into the blastula through cleavage reactions. So in a female, let's say, that has a cycle of an average of 28 days. So in a 28-day cycle, this begins on the first day of menstruation. Not the end of a period, but the beginning of menstruation. All right, and then within the first 14 days, follicles are developing in the ovaries, and an egg from one follicle will mature and be released. So then at about 14 days, we have an egg being released. And this window is when fertilization will occur. Fertilization has to occur within 1 day of this event. So the fertile window will be several days before this. Sperm can survive for a long period of time in the uterus and fallopian tubes, and then the fertile window ends within 1 day after ovulation. So this would be ovulation, and fertilization, if fertilization occurs, that will take place in the uterine tubes. Or the fallopian tubes. And then about 9 to 12 days later, while progesterone is stimulating the production of the uterine lining, preparing that uterus for implantation, implantation usually occurs 9 to 12 days after ovulation. And by that time, the embryo is in the blastula stage. right. And this picture right here just shows you some of the differences between hormones versus neurotransmitters. Hormones are signals that are sent through our bloodstream, whereas neurotransmitters are sent to specific locations through neurons and the axons attaching to certain types of cells, for example, a muscle cell. All right. The integumentary system consists of the skin and its adjacent particles like hairs, sweat glands, etc. So the skin is an organ, not a tissue. And it's a good example to show how, as an organ, we have all of the different tissue types in the skin. So the skin consists of 3 layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer. And in our epidermis, this is where we have our epithelial tissue. And we have a lot of connective tissue in the dermis layer. All this light pink stuff would be our loose connective tissue. And in the subcutaneous layer, we've got adipose tissue here, which is another type of connective tissue. And we've got muscle tissue also just beneath that adipose layer. And our nervous tissue extends to the nerve endings that are found in our skin, right? If we get a cut, we can feel it. So there are nerve endings in our skin. So we have nervous tissue also extending into the skin. So the skin is not a tissue, it is an organ, consisting of all 4 tissue types. All right, the last thing I want to discuss today is a brief introduction into homeostasis and thermoregulation. Your book goes into much more detail than we're going to cover. If you all are going to be studying for a PCAT, MCAT, etc. in the future, it may be worth revisiting these topics. But for this remote learning during the semester, I'm going to keep this portion fairly short. So homeostasis. Stasis means staying the same. Homeo refers to within. So it's the maintenance or the keeping everything the same within the internal environment in an animal. So homeostasis refers to not just temperature, but also pH, glucose, and temperature. So pH is maintained by our kidneys, which we won't be learning about this semester. Glucose is maintained by by the hormone insulin, and temperature is maintained through our metabolism and other mechanisms for thermogenesis or thermoregulation. So thermoregulation refers to all of the things we do to control our body temperature. So thermoregulation is just the maintenance of body temperature, whereas homeostasis includes other variables as well. All right, so mechanisms for thermogenesis include metabolism and an endotherm, right? Whenever we go through our metabolism, we're going to lose some of that energy as heat. So we can increase our metabolism by increasing muscle contractions through shivering. We can have goosebumps, which are muscle contractions at the very surface of our skin. Not only does that generate heat, but that results in the hair being raised. And that will trap air and help to insulate or warm animals. And this is more effective in animals like my dog than on the surface of the human body, which has a relatively reduced amount of hair. Other animals, like dogs, will get goosebumps or raise their hair on the back of their necks in response to threats. And this is an interesting adaptation because it helps them appear larger and more aggressive and can help ward off threats. Other ways of controlling body temperature will include vasodilation. So vasodilation is when our blood vessels dilate, and this will maximize heat exchange with the environment. So depending on whether you're in a cold or a warm environment, vasodilation can be warming or it can be cooling. Similarly, vasoconstriction is when the blood vessels constrict. So this minimizes heat transfer between the body and the external environment. So this can help retain heat if it's cold, or it can cool if it's hot outside. Other behavioral responses that can maximize heat production will include, or insulate animals will include huddling, like bees will huddle together during cold temperatures when they are staying in their hives. Moving and circulating or sitting in the sunlight are all mechanisms for heating. And then cooling mechanisms in a human might include sweating. That evaporative cooling occurs when the sweat evaporates from the surface of your skin. And other animals might pant in addition to, instead of sweating. So that panting involves the same type of evaporative cooling that would be found in, that'd be similar to sweating. So we're going to end with 4 definitions involving how animals thermoregulate, or classifying animals. We've already learned the difference between an endoderm and an ectoderm during Unit 4. So an endotherm is an animal that generates their heat from their own metabolism, which is colloquially called warm-blooded, because we can use our metabolism to regulate our heat. Ectotherms are colloquially called cold-blooded. They obtain their heat from their external environment. And so endotherms are typically homeotherms, but that's not always the case. So an endotherm can be a homeotherm most of the time. Homeotherm means that, the temperature is consistent within the human body. So a homeotherm, a human is a good example. Our body temperature stays constant. So humans are both endotherms and homeotherms. A lot of reptiles are ectotherms and poikilotherms, which means their body temperatures vary with the environment. But some ectotherms, if they have really good insulation, or if they change their position in the water column or in their environment, some ectotherms can in fact be homeotherms. And likewise, some endotherms can in fact be poikilotherms. But the general trend is that many endotherms are homeotherms and many ectotherms are poikilotherms. Those are just some general definitions on your terms list. That's where we're going to end it. And next week we'll be starting with the digestive system. Hope you all have a good weekend.